All right, folks, ready to tackle a big one, globalization. It's one of those words, it gets thrown around a lot. But we're going beyond the buzzword today, especially for those of you prepping for the UPSC, particularly that international relations paper.
It's definitely more than just a buzzword.
It is. We're diving deep into some excerpts from a text that really gets into the theoretical challenges of globalization, how it pushes us to think differently about the world.
It does. What I find really interesting about globalization is how it challenges those basic theories we use in international relations. That's like they get put to the test.
Right, like how do our old tools hold up in this new super complex world? Speaking of challenges, the source keeps coming back to this idea of interconnectedness. What does that even mean in the context of globalization?
Interconnectedness. Imagine like a giant knot, but instead of string, it's made up of everything. Trade routes, migration, social media, everything's tangled up, influencing each other.
Well, okay, I see it. A giant knot. And that's globalization.
It is, yeah. And it makes it so hard to understand, let alone analyze.
Okay, so how do we even begin to untangle this knot? Where do we start?
Well, that's where these different schools of thought come in. They each have their own way of looking at globalization. Like realism, for example.
Okay, realism. Those folks are all about power.
Exactly. And they'd say, hey, globalization, nothing new here. It's just the same power struggle. It's just on a bigger scale.
Interesting. But what about non-state actors? Climate change, those things don't really fit into that state-centric view, do they?
You're right, they don't. And that's where other perspectives become important, like liberalism. Liberals are way more optimistic about globalization.
More optimistic. How so?
Well, they see it as a good thing, driven by free trade. Leads to more prosperity, they say. Like Adam Smith's invisible hand.
Oh, yeah, the invisible hand. Quick reminder for those who might not know, Adam Smith, big name in economics, his theory basically says that when people act in their own self-interest, it actually, unintentionally helps society as a whole. It's a classic. It is. But I'm guessing not everyone is buying this whole, rosy picture of globalization. What about the neo-Marxist perspective? They tend to be a bit more critical, right?
Oh, yeah, they definitely push back on that. Big time. They'd say, hold on, globalization is just another stage of global capitalism. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer, inequality gets worse. For them, it's all about power imbalances.
So we've got these three big perspectives. Realism, liberalism, neo-Marxism. Each one gives us a different lens to view globalization through.
They do.
But here's the million-dollar question. Are these theories, developed way back when? Are they even relevant in today's hyper-connected world? Do they still hold up?
That's the big question, isn't it? And the source throws in this concept that really shakes things up. Reciprocal causation. Basically, in this interconnected world, everything affects everything else.
Okay, so think about it like this. For our UPSC folks especially, could you pinpoint the one thing that determines success in the exam? Impossible, right? Study habits, the format, your mental state that day, it's all connected.
Right. Exactly. It's the same on a global scale. Can we really say this caused that with absolute certainty when there are so many factors at play?
Right. So this interconnectedness, it makes it really tough to separate cause and effect. It's not so simple anymore.
It's not.
So where does that leave us? I mean, if we can't rely on those traditional cause and effect models, does that mean we're lost at sea, just surrounded by randomness?
Yeah.
Or is there another way to make sense of this interconnected world?
Well, the source suggests a pretty big shift in thinking, moving away from that, either logic. Instead, it proposes a more holistic, non-dualistic way of looking at things.
Non-dualistic thinking. Okay, I'm intrigued. What would that look like in practice?
Well, think about Buddhism. Interconnectedness is a core principle there. Or even chaos theory, where systems are so complex their behavior seems random, even if there might be some patterns underneath.
So are we saying we need to completely rethink how we understand, global events?
It definitely challenges our traditional ways of analyzing things, but think about what it could mean. If we can move past simplistic cause and effect models, well, it opens up a whole new way of looking at things, how they're all connected. It's pretty exciting, actually.
Yeah, it's definitely exciting. But beyond just figuring out how globalization works, there's this whole other layer, right? The ethical side of things.
Oh, absolutely.
Because all this interconnectedness, it's not just about economics and politics. It makes us think about our responsibilities to each other on a global scale. Pretty relevant for the UPSC ethics paper, too, wouldn't you say?
Definitely, yeah. That's where cosmopolitanism comes in, this idea that we have moral obligations to everyone, everywhere, not just the people within our own borders, like expanding that circle of compassion to the entire world.
Okay, so instead of us versus them, it's more like we're all in this together. Kind of like how we're seeing more emphasis on global issues like human rights these days.
Exactly. The source brings up a philosopher, Thomas Pogge, who talks about rights-based cosmopolitanism. Basically, everyone has inherent rights, no matter where they live, who they are.
So it's like taking human rights, something we usually talk about on a national level, and going global with it. That's a pretty big shift.
It is. Pogge breaks it down into three key principles. Individualism, individuals are at the center of moral concern. Universality, everyone has equal moral worth. And generality, our moral obligations extend to everybody, not just people we're directly connected to.
Wow, those are some heavy hitters right there. Are there, like, other philosophical arguments that support this cosmopolitan view?
Oh, for sure. The source mentions Honora O'Neill. She draws inspiration from Immanuel Kant, a major figure from the Enlightenment. Kant was all about universal principles, acting in ways that you'd be okay with everyone else acting.
Interesting. So how does that connect to globalization?
Well, O'Neill applies that idea to global ethics. We should treat everyone as an end in themselves, not just a means to an end, recognizing that inherent dignity in every human being.
I can see how someone like Peter Singer would also weigh in on this, with his work on global poverty, animal rights.
Absolutely. Singer focuses on reducing suffering. His argument is if we can prevent something bad from happening without sacrificing something equally important, we're morally obligated to do it, and that applies globally. Distance doesn't diminish our obligation to help. So alleviating global poverty becomes a moral imperative for him.
So we've got these strong arguments for a cosmopolitan ethic. But let's be honest, not everyone's going to agree with this whole one world morality. What are some of the criticisms?
Well, a big one comes from cultural relativism. They argue there are no universal moral values, that right and wrong depend on the culture. So imposing a single set of values on the entire world, it could be seen as ethnocentric, even imperialistic.
Right, like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. Each culture has its own shape, so a one-size-fits-all approach just won't work.
Exactly, and that leads to communitarianism. They stress the importance of local communities, shared identities. They argue that our strongest moral obligations are to those we share a community with, those with whom we have a shared history, culture, values. So a global ethic, from their perspective, could weaken those bonds, erode that sense of belonging we need.
Okay, so we've got cosmopolitanism over here, pushing for a global ethic based on universal values. And over there, we have communitarianism, highlighting the importance of local ties and shared identities. It seems like pretty fundamentally different ways of thinking about morality in a globalized world.
They are, and that tension is at the heart of a lot of debates about globalization. The source also brings up this idea of thin versus thick moral connections. Like, can we really care for strangers as deeply as we care for our family and friends? Are there limits to our empathy and compassion?
Whoa, that's a deep one. It really makes you think about the boundaries of morality and how globalization might be pushing against them. I'm starting to see how this interconnectedness isn't just reshaping the world. It's making us confront some really fundamental questions about our values, how we connect with each other as human beings.
Yeah, it's like globalization is holding up a mirror, making us question everything. And for our listeners out there prepping for the UPSC, this stuff is pure gold. Globalization is a big deal in the international relations and ethics papers, so understanding these nuances is key to, crafting those top-notch answers.
For sure, grasping these complex issues like how different theories play out, the ethical dilemmas, how to navigate all this interconnectedness, it all helps you analyze real-world situations and make strong arguments, which is exactly what the UPSC is looking for.
So true. It's not just about memorizing facts and figures, it's about understanding how the world works, critically. And honestly, this kind of deep thinking is valuable even beyond the exam. Whether you're a student or just a curious person, grappling with these ideas makes you more informed, more engaged with what's happening around you.
Absolutely.
So, before we wrap things up, how about a quick recap of our globalization journey so far?
Sounds good.
We started by exploring how globalization challenges our understanding of the world, right? Makes us question those traditional theories and wrap our heads around this wild interconnectedness.
Right. And then we jumped into the ethical dimension, exploring how globalization makes us confront these questions of moral responsibility. From cosmopolitanism, with its global ethic, to communitarianism, with its focus on local communities, we saw how different perspectives offer different ways of navigating this complex landscape. And that's a key takeaway, isn't it? There's no easy answer. Globalization is messy, multi-layered, and it raises these deep questions about how we organize ourselves, how we relate to each other, how we tackle those shared challenges.
Yeah, it
I think that's a
does.
powerful message for our listeners. Globalization isn't just some concept in a textbook. It's the world we live in. Understanding it, both the theory and the ethics, is crucial for navigating this interconnected world with all its challenges and opportunities.
Couldn't agree more. And as you continue with your UPSC prep or just your journey of learning and understanding, don't shy away from those big questions. Engage with them. Explore different viewpoints. Form your own informed opinions.
Love it. So to wrap things up, here's a final thought-provoking question for our listeners.
Hmm.
In this globalized world, how do you define your moral responsibilities?
That's a question we all need to think about. There's no single right answer, but the act of asking those questions, having these conversations, seeking understanding, that's what makes us more informed, more responsible global citizens.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And remember, folks, this is just the beginning. There's so much more to explore when it comes to globalization. So keep reading, keep questioning, keep those brains working. And if you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with your fellow UPSC aspirants or anyone who wants to, understand this complex